Hello everyone! Today we're going to be taking some ordinary modern pumps and turning them into 18th century latchet shoes. Back in ye olden days, before the advent of companies like American Duchess, historical costumers had to get a little bit creative when it came to footwear. Usually that consisted of finding a shoe in the store that had the correct shape and then either butchering it or covering it with floof to make it more historically inclined. The method I'm going to be looking at today is one that I didn't originate. It's been online. Lots of historical costumers have done this, and it basically consists of tearing apart a shoe, putting new fabric on it, and putting it back together. This is a great method if you want to have the fabric of your shoe match the fabric of your dress or be complementary, or if you want to put some embroidery on it or something like that. So without further ado, let's get started. First, let's talk about what to look for in your sacrificial shoe. The most important feature is the shape of the heel. You'll want what is called a Louis heel, or in the UK, a court heel. These enjoyed some renewed popularity in the 80s, so vintage shoes on eBay are a good place to look. There are also some modern pumps that have this heel, but they're a little harder to find. You'll also want to make sure the shape of the toe is somewhat pointed rather than round or square. I'm using Vicky by Mark Lemp Classics, which I found on clearance on the Sears website for about $12. Next, you'll need some 18th century appropriate fabric to cover your shoe with. I'm using this remnant of a burgundy Indian print home deck fabric from my stash, but if you purchase your fabric new, you'll need about half a yard. To make the tongue and latchets, you'll need a bit of thin leather. I'm lucky enough to have a leather supplier locally where I bought this hide, which cost about $18. If you don't want to use real leather, pleather or vinyl will work just fine. To bind the edges of the shoe, you'll need some half-inch cotton twill tape. Most stores only sell it in white, but you can easily dye it to the color that you need. If you want a fancy shoe, you can add some lace trim to the binding. The lace will need to be pretty narrow at about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch wide. I bought this lace trim just so I could use the little border. To hold everything together, you'll need at least one tube of shoe glue. One tube is usually enough to get through a pair of shoes, but you may want to pick up an extra one just in case there are any mistakes you have to go back and correct. Last but not least, you'll need a bit of scrap fabric in order to make your pattern. I'm using a bit of white cotton I had in my stash. The first step in making your new shoes is also the trickiest. You'll need to create a pattern of your shoe while the shoe is on your foot, which is tricky and weird and requires a bit of contortion. Wrap a piece of fabric around your foot and mark all the edges of the shoe, both around the sole and around the top edge. While the fabric is on your foot, mark out a general sketch of the shoe tongue. Once you have your general shape, you can then refine the edges of the shoe and the shape and size of the new tongue. Cut out your initial pattern and then try it on over your shoe to see if there are any places that need tweaking. In my case, I needed to bring up the top edge just a little bit on the sides. Be sure to include the shape of the top edge of the shoe when making any adjustments, as you'll need to be able to cut out the tongue separately later. To make a pattern for the back of the shoe, which includes the latchets, first secure the pattern of the toe to your foot with a bit of tape. Then take an L-shaped piece of fabric and lay it on top of your shoe, with the inside corner of the L about a half an inch back from where the tongue and the shoe meet. The top edge of the fabric should be aligned with the top edge of the shoe. The back of the pattern fabric should be long enough to wrap around the back of the shoe itself. Trace out the bottom edge of the shoe along the sole and sketch in the shape of the latchet, which is just a rectangle that follows the L shape. Don't worry too much about the width of the latchet, as we'll tweak that a little bit later on. As you did with the toe, even out the rough sketch lines of your pattern and refine the shape with it lying flat. Then cut out and test your pattern to make sure you are happy with the fit. Now it's finally time to start making your shoes. Start by gently prying off the rubber tip on the heel of the shoe. These came off pretty easily, but I have also had the heel tips of a vintage pair of shoe break and come off in pieces, so be careful if you're using an older pair of shoes for your project. I'm using one of my clay sculpting tools here, but a small screwdriver could also work for this. Next, start removing the sole of the shoe by working your screwdriver between the rubber sole and the shoe leather and levering them apart. You'll want to start at the tip of the toe, where the sole rubber is thickest and least likely to tear. This part is very time-consuming and somewhat frustrating, and it's going to take some time to get the sole off of the shoe. This is one of the places where vintage shoes are a bit easier to work with, as the glue has often broken down a bit, which makes them easier to take apart. Newer shoes like these, though, take considerably more effort. At a certain point, though, you'll have pried up enough of the sole where you can pull it apart by hand without needing a tool. Go slowly when you are removing the sole from the side of the heel, as this is where the sole is thinnest and may tear if you are too rough with it. To add the new tongue to your shoes, cut out 2 pieces of leather using the tongue part of your toe pattern. I used the tongue for my first trial pattern, so I didn't have to trace out a new piece. Be sure to include about 1/4 inch of seam allowance only along the bottom edge of the tongue. Liberally apply your shoe goo to the wrong side of one of your tongue pieces, and then fit the other piece onto it, wrong side to wrong side. Then, glue your shoe tongue to the front of your shoe, sandwiching the shoe edge between the front and back lower edges of the tongue piece. It helps to try on the shoe with the tongue in place before the glue completely dries, so you can see if there are any problem spots or if the placement needs to be changed. Shoe goo stays pliable for a while before it dries completely, so this is a good time to get all the tweaks out of the way. Next, we'll cover the heel in fabric. Cut a piece of your fashion fabric on the bias. You'll need the stretch of the bias to be able to fit the fabric smoothly over the curves of the heel. Don't worry about cutting the fabric to the heel shape, we'll do that later. Coat the entire heel of the shoe with shoe goo, and then lay your fabric on top of the heel. Move the fabric around, squishing out any glue bubbles and smoothing out any wrinkles. Now you can trim off the excess fabric. Don't trim it down right to the edge of the shoe, leave about 1/2 inch of allowance on all of the fabric edges. Spread some glue on the inside of the heel and smooth your seam allowance down over the edge. You'll want to have enough of a seam allowance here that the raw edge will be covered by the rubber sole once we put it back on later. On the underside of the heel, trim the allowance so it won't be blocking the holes that the heel cap snaps into. Spread some glue onto the heel and then smooth down your seam allowance. And that's it for the heel. Now it's time to cut out the fabric for your toe piece using the pattern that we made earlier. I decided to center my fabric so one of the big flower motifs was featured in the center front. Cut out your pattern piece, leaving a generous seam allowance around the bottom edge. It needs to be enough to cover the bottom of the shoe up to where the sole will be. I always err on the side of caution and leave at least 1 inch of extra fabric. On the top edge and around the tongue, you do not need to add any seam allowance, as these edges will be covered with your twill binding. Start by covering the top edge of the tongue with some glue. Line up the top edge of your fashion fabric with the top edge of the shoe tongue and firmly press them together, working out any wrinkles or bubbles. Continue to spread glue onto the shoe and smooth your fashion fabric down on top of it. Don't worry about smoothing your fabric over the tip of the toe yet, we'll come back to that. Keep working all around the shoe until you have the entire toe piece glued down and smooth. Now we can trim away some of the excess fabric on the bottom. You can use the leather on the bottom of the shoe as a guide for how short to cut the fabric. Once the fabric has been trimmed, spread some glue onto the leather on the bottom and glue down your seam allowance. Now we're going to get that toe fitted to our shoe. Sew a line of running stitches through the loose toe fabric. Spread some glue on the underside of the shoe and then pull the stitches to gather the fabric around the toe. Work the fabric with your fingertips, smoothing it down around the toe and adjusting the gathers as needed. It will take some time to get the fabric to lay flat, but don't worry, you'll get there. Next, cut your latchets out with your fabric doubled to give you 2 mirrored latchets. Be sure to include additional seam allowance along the bottom edge. The latchets are going to take a lot of strain, so we'll want to add some strength to them by giving them a leather lining. The leather doesn't have to cover the entire pattern piece, just the latchet strap itself and a bit of the side. Cover the wrong side of the leather with glue and adhere your fabric to it, wrong side to wrong side. This way the pretty side of the leather will face out as your lining. The shoe buckles that I plan to wear with these are designed to fit a 1 1/4 inch latchet, so I need to trim down the width of the latchet strap a bit. It's better to start with a latchet that's a bit wider than needed and trim down, since you can't add width once you're at this point. With your latchet assembled, it's time to add it to the shoe. Place a line of glue along the top edge, and then match your latchet piece to the top edge of the shoe. The latchet strap should cover the gap between the tongue and the shoe by about 1/2 inch.
With the top edge secure, glue down the rest of the side piece. We'll only need a ½ inch of seam allowance at the center back, so trim off any excess fabric. Spread some glue onto the shoe and glue down the back edge of the fabric. Trim off any excess fabric on the bottom edge, leaving enough to cover whatever will be exposed when the sole is put back on. To get a smooth finish where the side piece meets the heel, tuck the seam allowance of the side piece inward and glue it down over the seam allowance of the heel fabric. When finishing off the back seam of your second latchet, instead of gluing the seam allowance down flat, tuck the raw edge inward and then glue it down on top of the seam allowance from the other latchet. Now we're going to use our cotton twill tape to bind the remaining raw edges. When we do this, we're going to apply the glue to the binding, not to the shoe. This gives us a lot more control over where the glue ends up and cuts down on messy, errant glue stains. Coat the twill tape on one side and then glue it down over the raw edge of the shoe tongue. To make sure the binding is glued down firmly, I like to use these tiny binder clips as a vise to keep the tape secured as the glue dries. When you start binding the edge of the latchet, leave enough tape free at the bottom of the shoe so the sole will cover the raw edge. Work your way along the raw edge, clipping as you go. Before you bind the short end of the latchet, be sure to trim it so that it has a nice triangular shape. If your latchets are a bit long, then you can trim them down a bit too. Continue binding your raw edges all the way around until you reach the end of the opposite side. By the time you reach the opposite side of the shoe, the glue should have set enough that you can start taking off the clips. It won't be completely dry, but that's okay as long as you don't wear the shoes right away. At this point, if you wanted a more casual shoe, then you could go ahead and reattach the sole and be finished. But I like mine with a little more pizzazz, so I'm going to add some fancy trim. First, I'm going to cut off the narrow scalloped edge from the lace trim that I bought. Then I'm going to glue it down on top of the binding. Just like when I glued down the binding, I apply the glue to the trim so I have more control over where it ends up on the shoe. I don't need to clip on the trim, since it's not doing any structural work. Once the trim has been applied to all the binding, we're finally ready to reattach the sole. Oh, it's looking so good! Now it's finally time for us to reattach the sole. We're going to work backwards, from the heel to the toe this time. Start by spreading the glue onto the rubber and pressing it in place against the heel. Wrap some elastic bands around it to hold it together. I usually like to use the wide rubber bands that come around heads of broccoli, but I didn't have any, so I used hair ties instead. With the heel secured, spread a generous amount of glue around the remaining edges of the sole. Press the sole into place and secure with more elastic ties. You'll want to have really firm contact between the sole and the shoe, so you have a good seal and there's no threat of the shoe coming apart when you wear it. Unfortunately for me, I couldn't get good contact at the toe and the elastic wouldn't stay put, so I had to hold it in place until the glue set. The glue should be set enough after about an hour that you can remove the elastic bands. Of course, you can always leave the bands on overnight while the shoe dries to make sure everything is super solid before wearing. Last but not least, put the heel cap back on. Don't forget to add your favorite buckles.
And there we have it. That is our finished shoe. Isn't it cute? It is ready to go for all of our historical costuming events that may eventually one day happen again. I know this seems like a pretty involved project and it is kind of out of the normal realm for historical costumers, but the first time I ever did a shoe makeover like this, I started it on a Saturday thinking it would take me the entire weekend and I was done by mid-afternoon. So if you really want to try your hand at this, it doesn't actually take that long to create a really cute pair of new shoes. And the fun and slightly dangerous thing about this is that you can have shoes that match all of your dresses. If you use this tutorial to make your own pair of 18th century shoes, be sure to let me know because I want to come along with you on your historical footwear journey. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button below, and if you want to see more of my sewing adventures, costume events, and historical costuming related content, be sure to hit that subscribe button as well. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!